He told me not to embarrass myself in front of the mediator. And he said it with that calm little smile men like him wear when they think the spreadsheet already belongs to them. Not the house, not the accounts, not the future. The spreadsheet. Because in our marriage, that was where the real truth lived, hidden in cells and tabs and password-protected files, and those polished summaries he liked to print on heavy white paper, as if expensive paper could make a lie feel official. The numbers are the numbers, Ava. My husband, Grant Mercer, sat across the conference table in downtown Bellevue, his cufflinks flashing when he folded his hands. We're not here to do theater. It was 9:12 on a gray Tuesday in October, and I was staring at a marital balance sheet that claimed our life had somehow shrunk. 10 years of work, 2 properties, retirement accounts, an investment LLCI had asked about more than once. And yet the page in front of me presented us like a couple inching toward insolvency. Thin margins, tight cash flow, limited options, a convenient story. If the man across from me wanted me to accept less and leave quietly. The mediator adjusted her glasses. Grant's attorney slid another page toward me. My own attorney, Denise Holloway, didn't touch it. She only looked at me once. A small glance, quiet, steady, like a hand pressed briefly to the center of my back. I knew then that the day had finally arrived, the day the real numbers came out. Not because Grant was ready to tell the truth, because he had made the mistake of assuming I would keep doubting my own instincts longer than I had. 3 months earlier, when he first asked for a practical separation, he had stood in our kitchen with a legal pad and a voice so gentle, it almost made me hate him more. The late light hit the marble island, the one I had picked after comparing samples for 2 weeks, and he had talked about dignity, efficiency, preserving goodwill, like he was proposing a tax strategy instead of ending a marriage. He said litigation was messy. He said lawyers made everything worse. He said we were adults. He said if we stayed civilized, we could protect what mattered. That phrase kept coming back to me, protect what mattered. At the time, I still thought he meant our daughter, Sophie. She was 16, sharp-eyed and quiet, the kind of teenager who noticed mood before words. I thought he meant the house in Clyde Hill, the school district, the routines, the college fund, the things parents say matter when they want to sound noble. I didn't understand yet that Grant meant himself. I met Grant when I was 29 and working in internal operations for a medical supply company in Seattle. He was polished even then, precise, the kind of man who never raised his voice because he preferred to make you feel unreasonable for having one. He worked in private wealth management and liked systems, forecasts, risk models, strategic patience. He talked about markets the way some men talk about weather, as if he had a private relationship with forces the rest of us were too emotional to understand. I liked that certainty at first. After my father's chaotic years of failed businesses and bounced checks and promises that never landed, Grant felt solid. Clean lines, hard surfaces, reliable outcomes. He planned dinners 2 weeks ahead. He booked flights early. He read contracts. He tracked spending. When we got married, I felt like I had stepped onto stable ground. The truth was uglier and quieter. Stable ground. If you stood where he told you. The first few years were good enough to pass for happy. Condo in Queen Anne. Long weekends in Vancouver, a shared language of ambition. Then Sophie was born, and life tilted. My mother got sick the same year, and I cut back at work, then cut back again. Grant told me not to worry. He said his income could carry us. He said one of us had to be flexible. He said we were a team. Later, when my mother died and Sophie started kindergarten, and I tried to return full-time, he encouraged me to choose something lighter. Consulting, part-time operations work, something that kept me available for what became clear over time. School pickups, contractor visits, elder care for his mother during the year she fractured her hip, hosting his clients' wives for charity lunches I never wanted to attend, managing the remodel, remembering birthdays, reviewing invoices, handling anything invisible enough not to count as real work in rooms where men like Grant congratulated themselves for being providers. I did go back to work, but never in the way I'd planned. Flexible contracts, process design for small firms, remote projects. Enough to contribute. Not enough to look powerful on paper. That was not an accident. Grant never forbade anything. He was too smart for that. He only framed every major decision so that my ambition looked selfish and his looked necessary. By the time we moved into the house in Clyde Hill, the imbalance had texture. He handled investments. I handled life. He liked introducing me as the one who keeps the whole thing from falling apart, which sounded appreciative unless you heard the private version later. The part where he'd remind me that my income was inconsistent, that his name carried the mortgage approval, that sophisticated finances required expert handling. Still, I'm not stupid. That matters to me. Maybe too much. Because women like me get written into these stories as naive, blindsided, decorative. But I saw pieces. I just didn't yet know how they fit. I noticed when the tax returns were suddenly not worth bothering over. I noticed when Grant moved from one accounting firm to another and downplayed it. I noticed when quarterly account summaries stopped arriving by mail. I noticed his habit of turning his laptop slightly away from me. Not in a dramatic way, just enough. I noticed one winter that he opened a new LLC and brushed it off as a client-adjacent side vehicle. I noticed he said liquidity was tighter during the exact period we were somehow also paying cash for things that should have required more explanation. I noticed. And every time I asked, he would do that thing. That elegant, maddening thing, where he answered in a way that made the question sound imprecise. You're combining business cash flow with household cash flow. That account is restricted. That valuation isn't realized. You're reading gross as if it's net. It's more complicated than that. Maybe the cruelest lie in a marriage isn't a false statement. Maybe it's the repeated suggestion that clarity is beyond you. When he asked for the separation, he already had a draft asset schedule prepared. Of course he did. He presented it like an act of mercy. There was the house, though burdened by more debt than I expected. His retirement accounts, respectable, but not spectacular. My smaller SEPIRA, Sophie's 529 plan. A vacation property near Clay Elum that, according to his summary, had appreciated less than the market would have suggested. An investment LLC, Mercer Strategic Holdings, which he valued so conservatively it was almost insulting. He said the market had turned. He said tax liabilities were substantial. He said a lot of the apparent wealth was illiquid or encumbered. He said if we fought, the fees would eat everything, and then he showed me what he called a reasonable path. He would keep the Clyde Hill house temporarily for stability, then refinance later. I could take a cash equalization spread over 36 months. He would retain the LLC because I wouldn't want to manage that kind of risk. We'd split retirement assets. He'd cover part of Sophie's tuition and some support, though modestly, because his current cash flow was under strain. I remember staring at that document and thinking, this can't be right. Not because I knew the exact numbers, because the emotional shape of it was wrong. Grant looked too comfortable for a man taking such a supposed hit. I said I wanted full disclosures. He leaned back and gave the saddest little smile. Ava, you can spend $20,000 to discover there isn't a hidden kingdom. My attorney came into the picture because of a woman named Lena Foster, a neighbor 2 streets over whose divorce had detonated across our social circle 2 years before. People said she'd gone scorched earth. People said she'd become paranoid. People said all kinds of things women say about other women when it's safer to believe money only hides in vulgar marriages, not polished ones. I saw Lena at a grocery store in Medina not long after Grant handed me the first spreadsheet. She took one look at my face and asked, "Has he started acting patient?" I laughed before I meant to. It came out sharp and tired. She wrote Denise Holloway's name on the back of a receipt. "Do not hire a peacemaker," she said. "Hire a woman who knows where men bury leverage." Denise was in her 50s, silver at the temples, exact without being cold. She let me talk for almost 40 minutes in our first meeting. I told her the outline, the marriage, the cutbacks, the house, the LLC, the balance sheet, Grant's insistence that the numbers were leaner than they looked. I expected skepticism. What I got was stillness. At the end, she said, "Do you have tax returns for the last 5 years?" "Not complete ones." "Any loan applications?" "Maybe." "Refinance paperwork from 3 years ago?" "Any emails where he overstates assets to a bank and understates them to you?" "I don't know." "That's fine," she said. "People like your husband usually create 2 sets of truth. One for institutions they want money from, one for the spouse they want compliance from. Our job is to make those truths meet." The legal anchor landed in the first week. Denise filed for formal discovery. Grant hated that more than the filing itself. Not the divorce petition, not the parenting plan discussions. Discovery, subpoenas, requests for production, interrogatories, forensic accounting language, terms that turned his preferred fog into a map. The change in him was immediate and instructive. He became generous in places that cost him little. He told Sophie she could redecorate her room. He offered to keep me on the family phone plan for simplicity. He sent emails about being committed to fairness. He copied counsel on everything. He began speaking as if we were co-CEOs winding down a merger. Smooth, rational, documented. Then the pressure began in private. He'd stop by the house under harmless pretexts. Needed to grab cufflinks, needed a file, needed to check the irrigation controller before the first freeze. He would stand by the mudroom bench or the wine fridge or the back slider and look around with a softness that performed history, like an actor performing grief. "You know this doesn't have to become ugly. Denise is incentivized to escalate. You're going to burn through resources Sophie should inherit. You always said you hated conflict. That one almost impressed me. You always said, as if a preference stated in marriage became a weaponized clause in divorce." The first escalation came when the preliminary disclosures arrived. Boxes, PDFs, bank statements, missing pages, business records with redactions too broad to be accidental, valuation summaries without underlying work papers, a glossy packet from Grant's side presenting Mercer Strategic Holdings as a borderline burden, modest revenue, inconsistent distributions, exposure, deferred obligations. Denise spread documents across the conference table in her office and tapped a page with a red nail. "This is trying too hard," she said. It was a balance sheet for the LLC that looked professionally produced and emotionally manipulative. Too many caveats, too much narrative, too little raw data. The kind of presentation built not to inform, but to exhaust. Then she found the first crack. 3 years earlier, Grant had submitted a personal financial statement for a line of credit application tied to the Cle Ilum property. Denise got it through the loan file after a subpoena. The totals on that statement were nowhere near the totals in the divorce disclosures. Not slightly different. Not explained by market drift. Radically different. His claimed equity in Mercer Strategic Holdings alone was more than double what he now said the entire entity was worth. I sat in Denise's office with the loan application in one hand and Grant's current disclosure in the other, feeling a strange mix of vindication and nausea. My heart was racing so hard I could hear it. So he lied? I asked. Likely twice, Denise said. Question is where. The house felt different after that, less like a place, more like a file cabinet full of delayed understanding. Every room contained some memory that now had two meanings. The office where Grant said he was cleaning up planning documents during tax season. The butler's pantry where I once overheard him telling someone on speaker that a structure had to remain off the domestic radar until a transaction closed. The garage where he kept labeled bankers, boxes from old deals and household records, and where, one rain-heavy afternoon, I found a duplicate set of insurance declarations for a property I did not recognize. That property led us to the second escalation. It was a townhouse in Scottsdale, not in his name directly, of course not. It sat under a subsidiary tied to Mercer Strategic Holdings. There were usage logs, utility bills, association dues. Enough to show control, enough to suggest value, enough to raise a larger question about what else had been tucked into layered entities while I was being told liquidity was strained. When Denise confronted his counsel, Grant's side called it irrelevant, an investment convenience, minimal equity, no significant distributions. They said I was engaging in fishing expeditions. Denise smiled when she read that phrase aloud. Fishing expeditions are what guilty people call targeted questions, she said. The Scottsdale discovery changed the emotional weather. Grant stopped trying to sound patient and started sounding offended. He accused me of invading business privacy. He said I was humiliating him professionally. He said some structures included other people's interests, and I was risking collateral damage. He said I was listening to women with grudges. He said Denise was trying to create scandal where there was only complexity. I said very quietly, then produced the numbers. He looked at me for 3 full seconds. No smile, no charm. Just a blankness so cold it almost relieved me, because it was honest. That night, Sophie asked why Dad kept leaving the house angry. We were in the kitchen, rain against the windows, pasta half finished on her plate. She had inherited my face and his stillness, which made everything she felt look harder than it was. I told her the adult version, that divorce makes people defensive, that finances were being sorted, that she was not responsible for the mood in the house. She set down her fork. He thinks you don't understand the money stuff. It wasn't a question. I swallowed. Why do you say that? Because he talks slower when he explains things to you. It is one thing to experience condescension. It is another to realize your child has been watching it for years. The third escalation came through a woman I had never met, a junior controller who used to work for one of the entities tied to Mercer Strategic Holdings. She was not a dramatic whistleblower. She did not arrive with a box of secrets and a trembling conscience. She simply responded to a subpoena after leaving the firm and produced a batch of archived internal reporting that should have existed in Grant's disclosures, but somehow did not. Monthly internal summaries, distribution schedules, realized gains, real numbers, not the curated numbers, not the ceremonial numbers men take into mediation to educate their wives. The internal reports showed cash movements across entities that made the divorce packet look almost fictional. The Scottsdale townhouse was more profitable than disclosed. The Clay Ellum property carried less debt than represented. There were consulting fees routed through an entity Grant had portrayed as dormant. There were capital calls and reimbursements and intercompany transfers structured in ways I could not fully decipher. But Denise's forensic accountant, Daniel Kwan, could. Daniel was quiet and a little rumpled, and had the unnerving gift of becoming more animated the more dishonest a spreadsheet looked. He sat with us in Denise's office, projecting linked ledgers on a screen, while I drank a coffee that went cold in my hand. "Here," he said, circling entries with a digital pen. He reports low distributable cash to reduce apparent marital value. But internally, he's tracking owner benefit. Different language, same money. This line, and this one, and this one. He's also suppressing receivables by timing recognition after disclosure dates. I stared at the screen. Say that in English. He's making the business look smaller for divorce purposes by choosing the moment of truth. That line stayed with me. The moment of truth. Because that was always Grant's real profession. Not wealth management, not strategy, timing truth. He knew when to make things sound fragile, when to make them sound expansive, when to impress a lender, when to soothe a spouse, when to flatter a client, when to preserve optionality. Every version of him came with numbers selected for the audience. And yet even then, even with Scottsdale and internal reports and loan statements, I still did not know the full scale, because men like Grant rarely keep one hidden pocket. They keep a hidden architecture. The winter hearings began with temporary orders and restrained hostility. Grant's attorney argued for efficiency, proportionality, and privacy. Denise argued for full transparency, reimbursement for withheld disclosures, and interim support based on actual cash flow rather than the performance piece Grant had built from selective statements. The courtroom in King County Superior Court was colder than I expected. Not emotionally, literally. Air conditioning too high. A hum from old lights. People waiting with folders in their laps and their nerves folded under their coats. Grant looked expensive and exhausted in exactly the ratio he intended. He had mastered that look over the years. Successful man under unfair strain. But once the judge started asking direct questions about missing source documents, that look changed. Tiny shifts, a jaw muscle, a blink too fast, a glance at counsel. Nothing dramatic happened that day. No cinematic collapse. Real power rarely breaks that way. But the judge did order expanded production and warned both sides that incomplete financial disclosures would be taken seriously. Afterward, Grant caught up to me in the hallway near the elevators. "You are making a strategic error," he said softly. I had my coat over my arm. Denise was 30 feet away, speaking to Daniel. "I think you've said that before. You don't understand how many people are connected to these structures." "That sounds like your problem." His eyes sharpened. "If you blow this up, there won't be enough left to feel victorious." "There it is," I said. "You still think this is about my feelings?" For the first time in months, I saw something almost reckless in him. Not rage exactly. Contempt stripped of costume. Then the elevator dinged, and he stepped back into civility so smoothly it might have been magic. At Christmas, Sophie asked if we could still host brunch. Her friends were all splitting time between households, and she wanted one thing unchanged. So I said yes. I cooked too much. Cinnamon rolls, egg casserole, fruit, good coffee. The house glowed with borrowed normalcy. Sophie laughed in the living room with 2 friends from school. For 3 hours, I almost believed ritual could protect us. Then I found Grant in the study upstairs, not invited, flipping through a file stack I had left on the credenza. He didn't even look guilty. "This used to be my office too," he said. I walked in, closed the door behind me, and held out my hand. "Put it down." He looked at the top page. "You're going through reimbursement schedules now. Put it down." He placed it carefully on the desk. "You always did get most energized when you thought you'd discovered something." I felt heat rise to my face. "Get out." "Ava, listen to me. There are valuations in motion. If you keep pressing at midstream numbers, you will distort what this really is." I laughed then, a low, ugly laugh I didn't recognize as mine. "What this really is? Tell me, Grant. What is it today?" His mouth tightened. "A business environment you are not equipped to interpret. Maybe every marriage has one sentence that, once spoken plainly enough, burns away the remaining courtesy. That was ours." I opened the door and said, louder, "Leave my house." Sophie heard. Of course she heard. Her friends went quiet downstairs. Grant walked past me with the controlled face of a man who believes witnesses will shame the wrong person. He said goodbye to Sophie too brightly and left through the front door without his scarf. Later, Sophie stood in the kitchen, arms crossed, not crying, which was somehow harder to bear. "You should change the code," she said. So I did. January brought the depositions. I had dreaded mine. I imagined traps, insinuations, humiliation by detail. Instead, I found something steadier. Truth, when lived long enough, acquires its own muscle memory. I answered what I knew. I did not perform ignorance or expertise. I said when I had relied on him. I said when he had excluded me. I said that household management and child logistics had been assigned to me in ways that limited my income growth while benefiting his career. I said he routinely minimized or redirected financial questions. I said I believed marital assets had been undervalued. Grant's deposition was different. You could feel the pressure building even in the transcript rhythm. Long answers to short questions, definitions substituted for disclosure, precision used as delay. Denise let him talk just long enough to enjoy himself, then began laying pages in front of him, one by one. The loan statement, the internal monthly report, the Scottsdale records, a consulting invoice from an entity he'd described as inactive, a reimbursement ledger showing owner benefits coded as business expenses, each time the same choreography. He would scan the page. His expression would not change much. Then he'd say the document required context, that the characterization was incomplete, that ownership was layered, that timing mattered, that his earlier answer remained accurate in a different framework. At one point, Denise asked, "Mr. Mercer, is it your testimony that when seeking credit, you used a more optimistic framework, and when dissolving your marriage, you used a more pessimistic framework?" His attorney objected to form. Grant adjusted his tie. "My testimony is that valuation is not static." It was such a beautiful non-answer that I nearly admired it. Then Daniel found the thing that turned suspicion into architecture. A deferred compensation schedule. It appeared in a batch of year-end planning documents produced late and, according to Denise, likely by mistake. Buried in appendices, dense. easy to miss unless you knew what a missing piece should feel like. It tied Grant to performance-based payouts from transactions completed over 4 years. Transactions routed through advisory structures he had repeatedly described as separate from marital cash flow. The schedule did not just increase the value picture, it redefined the picture. Because once you included deferred compensation, contingent receivables, carried interests, and owner benefit expenditures that had been disguised as business obligations, the marital estate was not struggling. It was enormous. Not billionaire enormous, not tabloid enormous, but large enough that his proposed settlement now looked less like a harsh compromise and more like a carefully tailored theft. I sat in Denise's office while rain streaked the windows and listened as Daniel laid it out line by line. The Clyde Hill house had more equity. The Clay Elam property had been strategically burdened on paper. Mercer Strategic Holdings and its related entities generated more benefit than disclosed. There was a private lending portfolio hidden inside operating summaries. There were retained profits timed around reporting dates. There was likely more to come. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt grief, because there is a particular kind of heartbreak that comes not when someone stops loving you, but when the full administrative labor of their deception becomes visible. The calendars, the file versions, the passwords, the rehearsed phrases, the years in which they watched you trust them enough to simplify your own life, while they built an advantage from that trust. Denise let me sit with it for a minute. Then she said, "We're going to revise our strategy." That was the twist beginning to take shape. Until then, the case had been about proving underreporting. Important, yes, but conventional. Now it became about intentional concealment, reimbursement, sanctions, and leverage large enough to alter the entire settlement map. Denise filed a motion to compel further production, a request for attorney's fees related to discovery abuse, and a notice signaling she would seek an adverse inference if the court found the disclosures materially misleading. Grant's side responded with outrage. They called the analysis speculative. They accused us of conflating gross receipts with personal benefit. They said deferred schedules were conditional and uncertain. They said I was trying to turn a divorce into a punitive business audit. The hearing date was set for late February. In the weeks before it, Grant began unraveling in small, elite ways. Not public meltdowns. Public meltdowns are for men without training. He missed deadlines, sent contradictory emails, became too eager in calls with Sophie, asking if I seemed stable. Reached out to mutual friends he had ignored for months. Floated the idea that Denise was manipulating me. He even called my brother Nate in Portland, a man he had always treated like a cheerful afterthought, and suggested we were heading toward a mutually destructive legal spiral. My brother called me laughing. Did he just try to explain consequences to the family of the woman who balanced your wedding budget and caught your florist double billing you in 2013? Nate asked. Apparently. He picked the wrong sibling. That mattered more than I expected. So many parts of divorce shrink you into official categories: petitioner, respondent, custodial parent, supported spouse, dependent earner. It helped to hear someone remember I had always known how to count. The hearing itself was not dramatic from the outside. Most meaningful legal reversals aren't. They unfold in tone, document density, judicial patience running out by degrees. Denise presented the discrepancies with almost ruthless restraint. No speeches, just frameworks. Here is what was disclosed. Here is what was represented elsewhere. Here are the omitted schedules. Here are the classifications that benefited one narrative and contradicted another. Here is the prejudice to settlement negotiations. Grant's attorney argued volatility, uncertainty, business nuance, timing differences. He said opposing counsel was sensationalizing ordinary valuation disagreements. Then the judge asked Grant a question directly. Mr. Mercer, when your personal financial statement to the lender reflected substantially higher value, were you lying then, or are you lying now? Silence is a physical thing in a courtroom. You can feel it settle. Grant cleared his throat. Neither, Your Honor. The documents served different purposes. The judge's face barely changed, but I saw Denise write something on her yellow pad and underline it once. By the end of the hearing, the court ordered expanded disclosures again, imposed partial fee shifting, and set a stern tone no one could misunderstand. The court stopped short of a sanctions hammer, but the message was plain. The existing numbers were no longer presumed trustworthy. That should have ended it. A rational man would have recalculated, settled, contained damage. Grant was not rational where control was concerned. In early March, he made the mistake that finished him. He tried to force a mediation before full supplemental production was complete. His attorney framed it as efficient. Denise resisted, but the mediator had availability, and both sides agreed to at least convene. That is how I ended up in that Bellevue conference room on the gray Tuesday where the story opened, staring at yet another revised balance sheet, prepared by a man who still believed presentation could outrun evidence. Only this time. We were ready. The packet looked improved on the surface. More assets acknowledged, some values increased, a gesture toward credibility. But Denise and Daniel had already built a parallel model from source documents. They had charts, schedules, linked account trails, reconciliations between lender representations and internal reporting, and a summary of unreimbursed owner benefits. They also had one final piece, a bridge analysis showing that Grant's revisions still excluded streams of compensation he had no elegant explanation for. Grant walked in confident. That's important, because confidence changes the taste of a fall. He thought he was negotiating from damage control. He did not know the real numbers had finally been consolidated into one narrative, stronger than any performance of complexity. He did not know Denise had chosen not to tip that hand in advance. He did not know that Daniel, mild and wrinkled, and almost invisible in most rooms, had become the most dangerous person at the table. The mediator began with the usual ritual: positions, priorities, willingness to preserve assets, child-centered language. I said very little. Grant spoke often. He sounded almost compassionate when he described the importance of not overvaluing uncertain streams. He spoke of market conditions and obligations and tax drag. He acted like a man generously trying to prevent his estranged wife from hurting herself through misunderstanding. Then Denise nodded to Daniel. He slid a binder across the table. "I think it would help," he said gently, "to walk through the reconciliation." Even now I can feel the shift in the room when Grant opened to the first tab. Not shock, recognition. The expression of a man meeting the exact door he had hoped no one else could find. Daniel moved methodically, lender statement to divorce disclosure, internal reports to external claims, deferred comp schedule to missing marital cash flow, entity reimbursements to personal benefit, property equity adjustments, consulting revenue omissions, timing manipulations around quarter close. It was not flashy. It was worse than flashy. It was complete. Grant interrupted twice. The first time to question methodology, Daniel answered. The second time to say the model assumed ownership where only beneficial interest existed. Denise calmly produced an email bearing Grant's own language describing those interests as his. I watched my husband's face lose color by fractions. Not because he had been exposed as a cheater in some moralized, abstract sense. Because he had lost control of the numbers, and numbers were where he lived. At last, the mediator asked the question that cracked the last shell. Mr. Mercer, is there a reason these schedules were not included in your earlier disclosures? His attorney began to answer, but Grant lifted a hand slightly, still looking at the binder. For the same reason not every draft analysis belongs in a domestic file, he said. Denise leaned forward. These were not drafts. These were operational records and compensation schedules used for planning, lending, and internal valuation. Grant looked at me then. Not the mediator, not the lawyers, me. As if some final version of marriage might still rescue him. Ava, he said quietly, you know very well these figures are not spendable in the simplistic way this presentation suggests. I held his gaze. Years of being translated by him, softened by him, managed by him. Years of being positioned 1 inch away from my own confidence. And I said, I know very well you only call numbers complicated when they stop serving you. That was the moment the power began to turn in public. Not because it was a perfect line, not because everyone gasped, because it was true, and everyone in the room knew it. The mediation broke for caucus. Denise and I were placed in a smaller room with bad coffee, 2 legal pads, and a view of wet rooftops. She shut the door and finally let herself smile. He's hurt, she said. Is that good? It means he's improvising. Offers began moving after that, and each one told its own story. First, a modest improvement, then a larger equalization payment, then a revised support figure, then a restructuring of property division that suddenly made it possible for me to keep the Clyde Hill house outright if I preferred, with offset against disclosed interests. Denise rejected each one. Not theatrically, just precisely. Because now we were no longer bargaining with his story. We were bargaining with his fear of a record. There is a difference. The final hours of that day were a study in collapse by increments. Grant stopped using the word fairness, stopped talking about efficiency, stopped pretending this was mutual misunderstanding. He started asking for confidentiality language, mutual non-disparagement, limits on future forensic expansion, a cap on inquiry into related entities, protections, fences, quiet. That was when I understood the deepest truth of our marriage. He had never been protecting wealth. He had been protecting authorship. The right to decide what anything meant, what my labor meant, what his success meant, what our lifestyle meant, what enough meant, what complicated meant, what true meant. And now, sitting in that beige mediation room, with a legal pad under my hand and rain on the glass, I felt something inside me settle into place so cleanly, it was almost peaceful. I did not need him to admit anything beautiful. I only needed the record to stop lying. By 6:40 p.m., the broad terms were clear. I would keep the house, subject to a structured refinance, supported by actual asset allocation, rather than the paper-thin version he had tried first. I would receive a substantially larger equalization payment, front-loaded, secured, and not dripped out as a patronizing allowance. Retirement assets would be reallocated based on corrected valuations. Sophie's education funding would be fully preserved. Support would be based on actual available income streams, including deferred compensation structures. There would be additional fee contribution due to the discovery mess. The Clee Elam property would be sold or bought out at a real number. The LLC interests would remain primarily with him, but not at fantasy values. If final supplemental production contradicted current terms, certain provisions would reopen automatically. Not total victory. Real life rarely offers that. But it was a reversal so clear that Grant could no longer narrate himself as the sensible adult guiding a volatile woman toward reason. When we reconvened to confirm the framework, he looked older, still elegant, still pressed and polished, but older in the eyes, where panic had finally burned through vanity and left a calculation alone. The mediator asked if we had tentative agreement in principle. Denise answered yes. Grant's attorney answered yes. Grant did not speak at first. Then he said, "Subject to final documentation." Of course, always another layer between him and truth. We gathered our papers, chairs moved, pens clicked shut. The day that had begun with his confidence ended with him carrying a binder full of corrected numbers he could no longer charm into obedience. As we stood, he said my name. I turned. For a second, I thought he might apologize. Not because he was that man, because humiliation can make even proud people reach for theater. Instead, he said, "You could have come to me directly." I almost smiled. 10 years of translations and omissions and selective disclosures and tone as a weapon. And still, at the edge of his own exposure, he wanted to act like access had been the issue. I did, I said, repeatedly. Then I left. Outside, the air was cold and wet and smelled like pavement after rain. Bellevue traffic moved in slow red streams below the parking structure. Denise asked if I was all right. I said yes, and for once it was not a performance. When I got home, Sophie was at the kitchen island in an oversized sweatshirt, homework open, one earbud in. She looked up too fast. How bad was it? I set down my bag, took off my coat, walked over and kissed the top of her head. It was the day the real numbers came out, I said. She studied my face the way only daughters can. That sounds good. It is. She nodded once, like she had expected no less and hoped for more. I made tea. She finished geometry. The house hummed around us, familiar and newly mine. Not legally final yet, not fully settled, but changed in the essential way. Its walls no longer echoed with his version of events as the default setting. Every room felt less haunted by explanation. Later that night, after Sophie went upstairs, I sat alone in the study and looked at the built-ins, the desk, the lamp, the framed photos still waiting to be sorted. There was our wedding in Napa, Sophie at age 6 missing her front teeth, a summer at Cannon Beach, Christmas in matching pajamas that now looked like costumes from a company retreat. I did not cry. That surprised me. Instead, I opened my laptop and started a new spreadsheet. Not for the case, not for evidence, nay, for myself. House expenses, projected refinance options, college timing, repair list for the downstairs guest bath, income scenarios for consulting work if I expanded again. I entered numbers row by row, not because numbers save you, but because naming a thing clearly is sometimes the first form of freedom. For years, Grant had treated financial language as a private priesthood, a place where confidence belonged to whoever spoke fastest and sighed most deeply at other people's questions. But numbers do not love power. They only love accuracy. That had always been true. I had simply been married long enough to a man who benefited from making truth feel socially inaccessible. Near midnight, I found an old folder in the desk drawer labeled Home 2018. Inside were tile samples, contractor notes, appliance warranties, and a sheet of paper with my handwriting from years earlier. Kitchen budget revisions during the remodel. I stared at those figures and laughed softly into the quiet room. Even then, I had been catching overruns he missed. Even then, I had been reconciling estimates, noticing padding, pushing vendors back to the agreed scope. Even then, I had known more than he could afford to notice. The court paperwork would continue, drafts, signatures, technical fights over wording. There would be more fees, more emails, more ugly smallness before the legal ending arrived. But the true ending had already happened in that mediation room when Grant lost the right to define reality by tone alone. That was the real divorce. Not when he asked for separation. Not when lawyers got involved. Not when the judge frowned. When the numbers stopped obeying him. Weeks later, when the first formal settlement draft arrived, Denise forwarded it with a note that read, "Better. Still watching the definitions." That made me smile. Definitions. Always the battlefield. Grant's revisions were smaller now, less arrogant, more technical. He fought over timing, tax language, release scope. He no longer fought over the existence of value. He could not. The record had become too dense. Our final in-person meeting happened in a conference room with frosted glass and stale air. We signed preliminary documents, traded comments through counsel, avoided eye contact when possible. At one point, Grant asked if we should discuss listing strategy for Cleolum directly. Denise answered before I could. No. I almost thanked her out loud. When it ended, he gathered his Mont Blanc pen, aligned his papers, and gave me a look I recognized from the first years of marriage. Not affection, not respect, but assessment, as if he were still trying to determine the precise cost of underestimating me. He never got the full answer. Neither did I. Maybe that is for the best. Some losses should remain incalculable. Spring came slowly. Moss brightened on the stone wall outside. Sophie started talking about colleges in California and Washington and pretending she was not scared to leave. I took on more consulting work, then better work. Word spread in odd ways. A friend of a friend needed operational cleanup after a messy founder split. A boutique health firm needed process redesign. Then another. I found I liked being paid for systems again. I liked invoices with my name on them. I liked numbers that arrived without condescension attached. One afternoon, Lena Foster came by with pastries and stood in my kitchen, looking around like a woman checking whether a storm had truly passed. "You look expensive," she said. I laughed. What does that mean? It means peace is sitting on you nicely. We drank coffee by the windows. She told me her youngest had finally stopped calling her ex to ask where the old cereal bowls were. I told her Sophie had started locking the front door even when we were home. A small habit, a meaningful one. Before she left, Lena touched the edge of the island and said, "Funny thing about men who hide money. They always think the money is what makes them powerful. It's never the money. What is it then? Your uncertainty." After she left, I stood in the kitchen for a long time thinking about that. She was right. Money mattered, of course. Money is safety, space, counsel, time, the ability not to panic at the wrong moment. But what Grant had fed on for years was not the money itself. It was the softness he could create around it, the dependence, the hesitation, the moment a woman stops one step short of her own conclusion, because someone more practiced has already told her the subject is too complicated. The day the real numbers came out, that uncertainty ended. Not all at once, not like a speech in a movie, more like a lock turning from the inside. Sometimes I still hear echoes, his voice saying valuation isn't static, his patient little sighs, his warnings about not embarrassing myself, but they sound smaller now, like recordings played from another room. And when I think back to that morning in Bellevue, the white papers, the polished table, the rain-muted windows, the man across from me who still believed authorship belonged to him, I remember something else too. My own hands, steady, flat on the table, ready, because beneath the grief and the anger and the legal language and the years of distortion, there was a simpler truth waiting for me all along. I was never bad with numbers. I was married to a man who needed me to believe I was.